Daily Rambam for Thursday, Yud Gimel Tishrei Tavshin Pei Aleph, the 7th Perek of Hilchos Tefillin Mezuzah and Sefer Torah. So we concluded Hilchos Tefillin and Hilchos Mezuzah. Now we're moving on. We're advancing to Hilchos Sefer Torah. And at the beginning of the halachas, we listed there are two mitzvahs in Hilchos Sefer Torah. One is that every Yid, every person should write a Sefer Torah for himself, and one is that the king should write an additional Sefer for himself, so he has two Sefer Torah. And we're going to discuss these mitzvahs in this Perek as follows.
Are we meeting up when we buy a letter? When they finish?
I'm going to mention that. We're going to get into that. Perek Shvi Halacha Aleph. So it starts off with the mitzvah that everyone should write a Sefer Torah. Mitzvah Saseh Kol Ish V'Ish, the positive commandment to every person, every Jewish person. Lichtav Sefer Torah La'atzmai, to write his own Sefer Torah. Shenamar, as it says, V'at Kisvu Lachem Es Hashira Hazois. So you have this pasuk in Devarim that you should write this shira. Now, if you take it literally, so it's just a particular portion, whatever he's calling the shira over there at the end of Devarim. But no, what we say this means is that you should write the entire Torah, which contains, among other things, this shira. Why is that the pshat? You can't write only a parsha out of the Torah. You have to write the whole Torah at a time. So if it says write this shira, it must mean write the whole Torah, including the shira. Even if you already have a Sefer Torah in your possession, your ancestors bequeathed it to you, you have a Sefer Torah, no, the mitzvah is still to write one for yourself. And if you wrote it with your own hand, it's like receiving a Torah from Sinai, very special. And if you can't, and then you get others. That's where a professional sefer might come in. Back then, clearly, it was more common. People were able to write on their own. But if you couldn't, so then someone wrote it for you. And if you're even magia, you take a sefer Torah, an existing one, and you just fix even one letter, it's as if you wrote the entire thing. So if you look in Shulchan Aruch here today, Hilchos Sefer Torah, so the first siman there is siman Reish Ayin, which is about the schar mitzvahs ksiva Sefer Torah. So the Mechaber starts off and says it's a mitzvah say to write a Sefer Torah. Shaynos in the Rambam, even if your ancestors left one for you, you should write. Then it's into to sell it. The Rambam gets into the not being able to sell it later in Perek Yud, so I'm not going to quote that now. Then you have the Ramah. So the Rambam says if you hired a sefer, he already uses those words, sefer Torah, or you bought it and there's a mistake and you're a magia it. So that's how he phrases it. So then it's as if you wrote it, but if you just took it that way and you weren't magia it, then it's kachaytif mitzvah min hashuk ve'ena yetze b'zeh. That's not the same thing. You have to. If you get a sefer, you should also be magia a letter. Perhaps writing a letter at the end is in line with that. So that way you have a participation in the actual ksiva itself. Then the Mechaber adds another sif. The Mechaber says, Ha'idna, nowadays it's a mitzvah to write Chumshei Torah, Mishnah, Gemara, Perek, the Jewish library, the classics. But La Yimkreim, and then the similar halachas about not selling them, which is taken from the halachas of not selling a Sefer Torah. So where does this sif, the second sif, show up from? Look in the Torah. The Torah says in Siman Reish Ayin, V'kasav Adoni Avi Harash Zal, this was only said about originally. They used to write a Sefer Torah, and then that was what they literally learned from. That was the text. That was the only text you actually studied, was the Sefer Torah. There was nothing else. That was the whole library. We got a Sefer Torah, we write a Sefer Torah, then we just leave it in the shul to read in public settings. So mitzvahs aseh, I'll call you Yisrael. So what's the mitzvah for every year that if you can afford it, Mishnah, Gemara, Perek, that's what you're going to be studying, you and your family, your children. Because the mitzvah of the Ksivas HaTorah is so that was originally talking about the Sefer Torah, but what's the point? The point is it's whatever you're going to actually be studying. So through the Gemara, through the Perushim of the Gemara, that's how you're going to learn the mitzvahs. That's how you know the dinim. So lachin hein asvanim she'adam mitzvah lekasvam, and then the additional halachas of not selling them kick in for that reason. So you look in the Beis Yosef there on the Torah. He quotes the Torah, the Rosh. It says v'yesh lo t'maya. Beis Yosef can't understand. Heich ba Rosh lifter la'adam mitzvahs ksiva sefer Torah. The Rosh can just cancel a mitzvah like that and say lachlifa. No, we can just replace it with something else.
With the Iran?
Charlie told, he says the whole, he said, the Rosh's whole logic was that nowadays we're not learning from the Sefer Torah, we're leaving it in Shul. So he said, Rabbi Zoy, that's the problem. The problem is that we're just buying Sefer Torah, we're leaving it in Shul, and we're not studying it from them. So he says, what the Rosh should have said, so you should be Meir. Please write Sefer Torah and learn Chumash from your Sefer Torah. That would be the right thing to say if that was the problem. You're going to use that logic to pater, to exempt everyone from the mitzvah of Sefer Torah. Jesus says, in my opinion, near the Loimar, near the Li, that it's being mechadish. He's adding an additional thing. That in addition to Ksiva Sefer Torah, you should also write Chumash and Mishnayos and Gemaras and the Pirushim. Shigam Zeh, this is also included in the mitzvah Ksiva Sefer Torah. And that would be more of a mitzvah than just writing a Sefer Torah and then leaving it in shul. But if you actually wrote a Sefer Torah and you used it and you actually studied it at home and you learned from the Sefer Torah at home, pshita, that would be the ikar kiyum mitzvah saseh, because you're doing what they used to do in the Torah Sarishena. So although the basis is though conceding to the Rosh that it is more of a mitzvah to get other svarim, to print, to write other svarim, the Rosh wrote it, obviously there wasn't printing. By the time the basis came around, there was printing. The get other svarim would be more of a closer to the intent of the mitzvah than just donating a Sefer Torah to a shul. But ideally, he says you can't take away the original mitzvah, which would be to write it and to use it. Now, of course, this is something that Rabbi had a lot to say about. So first of all, there's a sicha, look at the sichas Chelek Chav Gimel, Shavuos Aleph. This is from the sichas of Achin Shal Pesach and Kadesh and Tavshim El Aleph. So there, the Rebbe is actually explaining more of the Rosh's position. The Rebbe was clearly always bothered by the fact that this mitzvah isn't being performed. So it seems like the first approach that the Rebbe took was to actually justify and build up the Rosh's explanation as to why we don't write a Sefer Torah. So the Rebbe quotes the Rambam over here. He says, well, you have to understand why is no one doing this mitzvah. So a pashtus could be according to the Rosh, right? The famous Rosh that we just quoted. But even according to the Rosh, now we have printed svarim. So what exactly all you're doing is buying the sefer. You're not really when you commission a sefer Torah, you're having it written. Maybe if you commission the printing, maybe that would be something. But you're just buying svarim. So then, even according to the Rosh, what are you actually doing? So the Rebbe says, according to the Rosh, the whole point is that it's the outcome, it's the effect, what you're trying to achieve through the sefer Torah, through the svarim. So according to the Rosh, even the writing is not really the main part of the mitzvah. It's a detail in the mitzvah. In the olden days, how you gonna learn? You need a sefer Torah. You have to write a sefer Torah. So that was just the reality was that writing a sefer Torah was very integral to learning Torah, to transmitting Torah. So that's why the mitzvah was phrased that way. But Bisman Hazeh, where anything you can buy, go to the store and buy a set. So not just the Sefer Torah shifts the Svarim, but even how you go about it shifts. You don't actually have to do anything. You just need to go and get the Svarim, and that would be enough. Of course, there are many more details in that Sikha, but that's the general gist of that Sikha in Hilchos Gimel. Right. Right. Interestingly, in that sikh, there's a footnote that mentions, what about buying letters in a Sefer Torah? And that sikh says, but not clear if that actually works, for different reasons. But
it's similar to what Ram said. If you fix a Sefer Torah with one letter, and if you buy a letter, so you're like mishtatef and writing. Right,
but there, it's fixing a letter, at least it's yours. Here, the problem is more that can you consider it yours by just buying a letter and being mishtatef with a bunch of other people? Well, you got to go to Sichas Chiluk Chavdal Vayelach Beis, and these are from the Sichas from not even a year later. Yutas Kislev Tavshim and Beis, and the Sichas after that. So there, the Rebbe got back to the same question: why don't we see that every Yid is writing a Sefer Torah? Bar mitzvah bacher. As soon as you turn bar mitzvah, you should get to work. Start writing the Sefer Torah. There was actual question is even on the pshat and the chumash. Why it doesn't seem like in the chumash everyone in the story of the Torah doesn't seem like everyone immediately scrambled to start writing a Sefer Torah. So it's really a question on the end now. Why doesn't anyone write a Sefer Torah? And if you say it's because of the svarim, so maybe a bar mitzvah bacher should run to the store the second he becomes our mitzvah. I mean, it happens to me we do give a lot of svarim to bar mitzvah bacher, but it doesn't mamish run that second to get svarim. And of course, then you have the poskim that say that the Rush really isn't replacing the mitzvah of Sefer Torah, it's just adding, not replacing. So why don't we see that Gedolei Yisrael are always trying to write? So then the way the Rebbe explains it over here is that every Kehillah has a Sefer Torah that was written by the whole tzibur. Every shul has Sefer Torah. It's sort of very often it's written by the tzibur. Everyone contributes to some extent. So there's a concept of leiv based in masna aleim that sometimes based in can sort of have a mind and include everyone in something. So leiv based, and even though no one actually formally went and said anything or did anything, but there's this concept, this amorphous leiv based, and Masna Aleim says that it's being written on behalf of everyone, and every once in a while we are Magia the Sefer Torah, and we know, of course, that being Magia is like writing. So even if you were born after the original writing, but now next time there's a Haggah, so you're participating in the Haggah, and it's actually comparable to Esregim, Yonah D'Yoma. It says you're not supposed to have an esrog b'shutfus, but l'maisa the practice was in Europe, plenty of times, plenty of places, it wasn't really possible. The Shraga were not distributed in great quantities the further away you got from Italy and Eastern Europe or wherever. So the sources say there's some kind of legal thing that we say that since everyone bought it and they want to be yaitza with it, so whenever someone uses it, everyone in the Kehillah is sort of giving him their part. So when he's holding it, it's like everyone gave him a manas that he should be yaitza, and then he'll return it. So we see that when it came to Shraga, we came up with something like that. So something similar for the Sefer Torah that belongs to the tzibur. Even though you have a chayim that say that esrog isn't quite like a Sefer Torah. Esrog could be of shutfim, because as long as it's yours, b'shas the mitzvah. But the Sefer Torah, it's not like the mitzvah of the Sefer Torah isn't that when you make a chveis, when you say Baruch Hashem, we get an aliyah, that it should be yours. The mitzvah is that the Sefer Torah should always be yours at every moment. The esrog, at this moment it's fully his, and he returns it. At this moment it's fully his. All you need is just for that one moment. But the Sefer Torah, really, it's supposed to be yours at all times. So how can we compare esrog to Sefer Torah? But that was a mo. You actually had to learn like the same idea. You used to have to learn from the Sefer Torah. That was the whole point. Now we're just using it for kriya. So whenever there's a kriya, so you get an aliyah specifically. That's how when you're yaitza the mitzvah tak, when you get that aliyah, then you're actually reading from inside the Sefer Torah, and then and everyone's allowing you for it to be yours at that moment, and that's how it would work. And that's how the Rebbe explains to the Gabi Moshe Rabbeinu at that time, whatever happened at that time. And the punchline being that this is where the idea of an ois in the Sefer Torah comes in. So not only do you have the concept of leiv based in Masna Aleim, which already existed for centuries, but actually participating with the matbeya, you can say this letter is yours, that adds something to that. So that's what the Rebbe had to say, at least somewhat the Rebbe had to say on this subject. Moving on now to halacha Beis and halacha Gimel about the king's additional mitzvahs. HaMelech mitzvah lichtavay Sefer Torah acher la'atzma l'shem HaMelech. So he has to have an additional one, specifically as king. Yoser al Sefer Shahaya like Shu Hedjit. In addition to the one he already had as an individual, no one's born a king, so you already had one as a Hedjit, presumably, and now you became a king, so you had another one. Shnamar v'haya k'shifta kisim HaMelech v'kasavlei. So first, once you become the king, then you're writing this additional one. Magia Naisem is Sefer Hazara, Alpi based on Nagalo. So there's a concept, there's a Sefer Hazara, there's a special Sefer in the Beis Hamikdash, that's the most Muga, to make sure that's the most correct. The based on Nagalo are involved, and the king's special Sefer Torah is copied from there to make sure that it's the very best text. Because the Mishnah says, Tzarachian, Minale, where did the Rambam get this particular tidbit from? But that's what the Rambam writes. And then what do you do with both? So you have this one, you have that one. So the one you had from before, he puts that in his treasury. The one he wrote, or the one that was written for him, once he became king, that he should always have that one. If he goes out to war, it's with him. He enters, he returns, it's with him. He's at a court proceeding, he has it. If he's lying down to eat, I guess, so then it's not with him, it's across from him. So it's literally supposed to be with him at all times. We didn't say that about the regular Sefer Torah, which is why even the king puts it in his Beis Kanazav. But the second one has to constantly be with him. It's just part of his gear. What if he didn't have one from before? So we're acknowledging that's a possibility. So Tzarech Lichtiv, Ach Hashemalach, Shnei Sefer Torah, you would still have to write two. You can't just skip to the second one. One, again, goes where it belongs. The second one should be with him always. You should only part with it at night. Or when he enters the bathhouse, or the bathroom, or to sleep on his bed.
What's the purpose of a Beis Gnazov?
The purpose. What do you mean? In what sense?
One always he puts there. What does it do there? Saying it's
you have to make the mitzvah, so it has to be somewhere. It's just to emphasize the contrast between the one that he's constantly carrying. I don't know if it's literally. I mean, the point is that clearly he's going to be using the one that he's holding on his person at all times. So where's the other one going to be? Put it in a safe place. I think that's the extent of it. The Kasem Mishnah points out that this is based on Mishnah and Sanhedrin and Brayso and Sanhedrin, these different details about where it is or where he doesn't take it. But one thing it adds is that that he makes it like a sort of a kameya, an amulet, and he hangs it from his arm. And the Kasem Mishnah says, why does the Rambam skip that? Maybe the Rambam doesn't like anything that has to do with kameyas. I don't know. But the Rambam does not mention that detail. The Rebbe mentions it in the footnote to one of the sichos. The Rebbe mentions other achreinim ask, how would you even go about doing that? What would be the logistics of having it on your arm? But the Rambam just skipped that entirely. So now we're going to get to a number of halachas about how one writes a Sefer Torah. To keep in mind, they already have a number of halachas that we already learned in Perek Aleph, right? Or right at the beginning with Hilchos Tefillin. And the Rambam actually is going to list them very quickly at the beginning of Perek Yud. The iris, what kind of you're using, which animal it's coming from, or ibud iris, how you process the skin. That has to be ibud l'shma. So that was mentioned in Perek Aleph. We mentioned short in Perek Yud. It's brought in Hilchos Sefer Torah and Shulchan Aruch, actually right in the beginning. So keep that all in mind. Let's see what the Rambam discusses over here. Sefer Torah shekasvay shalei b'sirtut, shekasvay miktsasei ala gvul miktsasei ala klaf. Puzzle. So if it's lacking sirtut, you already learned sirtut is the lining, the lines that you make for the rows. So if it's lacking that, or it's not completely on gvil or completely on klaf, it's part gvil, part klaf, it's puzzle. So we already learned in Perek Aleph, halacha l'moshe misinai, that Sefer Torah should be on gvil. Gvil is the complete hide. You don't separate it at all, and you have to write Mekayim HaSeyar where the hair was on the outside. Now I don't add it over there that even though it's halacha l'moshe misinai, but if you wrote the Sefer Torah on klaf where you separated the klaf from the chsustos, the klaf would be okay, and the gvil was basically telling you that definitely not the chsustos, but gvil or klaf are both okay. And here the Rambam is adding that it has to be, you have to commit to one. You can't have partially this and partially that. Kaisvin Sefer Torah. How do you actually go about writing it? First of all, it has to be very nice writing. This shouldn't be some kind of script. So these aren't literally talking about the Ksav Ashuri here or the Dikta Koesius, but just saying it should be beautiful lettering. The space between each word should be the size of a small letter. And the space between each line should be about another line. The length of every line should be about 30 letters. So that's 10-letter words. So be able to write that 3 times. And that's the width of every page of the Torah, every and the line shouldn't be shorter than that, because then it looks more like a regular letter. Right back then, of course, people wrote letters on klaf as well. So you have to distinguish. The Sefer Torah should not be too interchangeable with a regular letter. And it shouldn't be longer. The lines shouldn't be longer. Your eyes shouldn't have to be racing back and forth. Halacha, hey, don't make the font small because you're getting nervous and you need space between one parsha and the next. So I need more space. Let me make the letters smaller. Don't do that.
Some letters are bigger sometimes. there's a few letters in the Sefer.
Right, that's a specific thing. The Rambam is going to mention later in Halacha Ches that there is certain traditions about certain letters being different. That's a separate case. Of course, some Sefer Torah are just written with much larger letters, and some are written with much smaller letters. But within the Sefer Torah itself, don't start writing in smaller letters because you feel pressure that you want to start another parsha on the same line and there's not enough space. So don't do that. Make sure it works out without doing that. Let's you have a 5-letter word. You're getting towards the end of the line, so don't write 2 within the page and then write 3 letters all going off out of the page. You could have 3 within the page and 2 going off, but not 2 within the page and 3 going off. That was 3 right is like a full word. It's like you wrote a full word out of the row. That's not good. So if you don't have room for another 3 letters, just leave the space empty and start from the next line. Of course, say from today, they already have it all worked out. They make sure that they'll drag a letter out if they need to. They'll make a letter very long, so that way it looks nice. That ends at the end of the line. But in theory, it doesn't have to end at the end of the line. If you don't have room, just go to the next line. Halacha Vav. Let's say you have a 2-letter word. Don't just throw it between the columns. That's a 2-letter word. No, just go to the beginning of the next line. So what if at the end of the line you have a 10-letter word, more or less? And you don't have enough space to write it all within the page. So you can write half within and half going out, that's okay. And if not, you leave it empty. So the Rambam is taking the previous halacha about the 2 letters versus the 3 letters, and he's expanding it to even a 10-letter word. You can write 5 here and 5 there. And the Kesef Mishnah says the Rosh disagrees and says no, it's only the 5-letter word with 2 letters sticking out. But once you get more than that, then it's not okay. Halacha Zayin. Umaniach ben kol chumash v'chumash arba shiten pnuyos b'lei ksiva le'pachas v'lei yeser. Of course, the chamisha Torah, so between Bereshit and Shmos, etc., there should be 4 empty lines without any writing, no more nor less. Le'pachas v'lei yeser v'yaschol hachumash mitchila shita chamishas. And the chumash, whichever section you're writing, should start from the 5th line. So 4 empty, start from the 5th. When you conclude the entire Torah, the end of Dvarim, it should conclude in the middle of the last line at the end of the page. That's how it should end off. And what if, it looks like at the rate you're going, you're going to be in the middle of the Amud, daf. So Mekatzer v'Eila. So he says, well, in that case, you should actually make the whole daf, the whole Amud, very, very narrow. Write a few words and then go to the next line and go to the next line. So what we said earlier about Shleisha Moisius is going to have to go out the window over here for this one. Miskaven Adshi Le'eni Kol Yisrael Be'em Tashida B'Sefer Daf, and all to work it out so that Le'eni Kol Yisrael, those last 3 words are in fact in the last line in the page. Again, nowadays Sefer have a lot more figured out, planned out, so it's not really an issue. Now that Rambam mentions those interesting letters, the Rambam says Vizar Bo'esius Hagdoilas, Bo'esius Haktanis. You have the unusually large letters, unusually small letters. Bo'esius Hanakudas. You have the letters where you have dots on them. Nokud al whatever. You have the dots. U'Ba'esius Shetzuras Meshunas. The Rambam mentions an additional thing which is not so familiar today. Going to pay in halafufais, Bo'esius Ha'akumais. So a pay and halafufais are pays that they keep on going. It's like a pay inside a pay. It's like a swirl. And then you have Oasis Akumas, crooked letters. Also, they just you make the part of the letter at an angle. As the Sefer know, it's not even really a Talmudic thing. There's like certain things that are less for the Paiskim and more for the Sefer. The Sefer consider it their domain. This is one of the things where the Sefer copy one from the next. I believe there may be some, maybe the Teimanim, some may still have the tradition going on nowadays. I think the Rishonim and Ashkenaz still had a lot of it. I think the Baal Torah in many places will mention things about the letters in Sefer Mosim, but for some reason at some point it dropped out of our Messiahs of Safras. I see the Mitzvahs of some Sefer about it. V'yizar b'tagen u'b'minyanan. And you're supposed to be careful with the tagim and counting how many tagim. Yesh oish yesh la tag echad, yesh oish yesh la shiva. Some letters have one tag, some letters have 7 tagim on them. The whole tagim consider zayin, and every tag, every crown is like a mini zayin. Dakin kechut hasara, very very thin, like a hair. But that's what a tag is. So Rambam is not getting into the details, just saying that if you're a sefer, so you know about all these things. Halacha tes. Last things we just mentioned here in halacha ches. Kol advarim ha'elu. Or even the things before that. All of these things are just to make your Sefer Torah better. So if you didn't do it exactly the way he said to do it, you changed. If you didn't get the tagan right, but you got the letters right, or the letters were the rows were too close or too distant, or the lines are too long or too short. As long as 2 letters aren't touching each other, and you didn't add any letters or take any letters out, you didn't change any shapes of any letters, and you have the parshias, the psuch, the stasim, you have it all, psuch and stum, you have it all right. So that's the list of what really matters, and everything we've been talking about the last few halachas is mitzvah and a muvchar to do it right. Now that Rambam goes on and adds some additional points, and the Rambam says, there's some additional things that are not mentioned in Talmud and the Gemara at all, but the Seferim, it's their thing. But Kabbalah, they have their own Kabbalah outside the Talmud. They have their own Kabbalah. And it says follows: that the number of lines on a daf of the Torah should be no less than 48 and no more than 60. And if you have 2 parshias, you have a space between 2 parshias, so it has to be a space of 9 letters, like you'd write asher. And this additional thing that Rambam describes here, now on the page where you have the Shiras Hayam, which is written in a unique way, there should be 5 normal lines on top, and they should start with the following words from those psukim: the word Habayim, and the word Bayabasha, and the word Hashem, and the word Meis, and the word Mitzrayim. Those are the beginnings of the first 5 normal lines on the page, Chamesh Shittin. Then you have the Shira, and then Ulamatam Shira. Then once the Shira is completed, there should be another Chamesh Shittin, 5, and Tchilas Kol Shittim and Kach, and specifically it should start with these specific words: Vatikach, and then Achra, and then Sus, and then Vayetzu, and then Vayavayu. That's their tradition. And similarly, the page of Hazinu, which is also done in a unique way. So on top of that, you have the following 6 lines: Va'ida, Achre, Hadarach, Ba'achres, Lach Isai, Kahal. That's Shei Shittin. You have 6 lines. And the bottom 5 lines: Vayove, Ladaber, Asher, Hazois, Asher. Rambam says, again, it's all just extra machina like pasal. If you didn't do it quite this way, not a pasal sefer Torah. This is again alam kasva mole chaser. Oh yeah, chaser mole. So before we just said about adding letters, not taking away letters. What about mole and chaser? Mole and chaser is a bit different than adding and taking away letters. I don't think a letter sounds like you're just randomly adding a letter where it doesn't belong. But here you're talking about mole and chaser. So a word can be spelled fully, or a word can be spelled with a vav, without a vav. So what about that? Of mila shikra, which we call a kri ksiv. So shekasav mila shikra, the kasav kikriyasa. So you have a word where there's a kri, and instead of writing the ksiv, you wrote the kri. And then shekasav yishkavena v'mekayim yishkalena. Right. So we know that you write the yishkalena and you read it yishkavena. What if you wrote yishkavena? Another one there about chayrim v'mekayim v'afaylim v'chayetze behen. If you messed around with which parsha should be open, which parsha should be closed, the space between the 2 parshas, or you just didn't do the shira correctly at all, you wrote the shira like a regular line, or the opposite, you wrote a regular parsha of the Torah in the manner you're supposed to write the shira. That's not okay. It's literally just not Sefer Torah at all. It's what you'd call a chumash, as we'll see later. I mean, the term chumashim existed back then. The term chumashim was used for things that look very similar to Sefer Torah, but they weren't written quite according to the halachos of Sefer Torah. It was just it was still ink on parchment, because that's what Sefarim look like, but it's not quite a Sefer Torah.
From this couple of words that Rambam said, chumash min chumashim, to what we spoke about the Rosh, the concept of a whole swarm. We see that the Rambam looks at Sefer Torah as
Right.
a whole different concept.
Right. In the Gemara, you have the Chumashim for the Tanaikas, specifically the Tanaikas learn from a Chumash, and seemingly adults learn from a Sefer Torah. That seems to be the connotation. Obviously, by the time you go, later generations, like the Rosh said, no one's really learning from a. That's why the Rosh was talking about Chumashim, because all the learning was being done from Chumashim. Now, the question, these halachas raise a question about Malayas and Chaseris and Sefer Torah. So first of all, there's a general question: are we actually very confident that our Sefer Torah got the Malayas and Chaseris right for 3,000 years? There's also the specific question of, we know that there are disparities. We know that there's a list, whatever it is, 11, 12, 13, the Ashkenazim versus the Sfardim versus the Teimanim. The most famous one we all know about is Daka. Does Daka have an Aleph? Does Daka have a It's actually a Chaser and a Yatir, but it's a similar concept. It doesn't actually change the pronunciation. You have in Parshas Noach, Vayihi Yemei Noach, or Vayihu. A few years ago, nowadays with databases, you have to be careful because sometimes you have the text of the Chumash in a database is taken from some Sefer where they say we're going to use the manuscripts. They believe in using evidence or they don't just go with whatever Masorah they had in their community. So the database will have a different text, and then you print out a Kriya for Shul. So a few years ago in 770, the Balkaida was reading Parshas Noach, and he got to this pasuk, and he said Vayihi, and everyone was correcting him, Vayihu, and it's not our Masorah, it's not our Sefer Torah, it's B'daf Ganat. But anyway, the question being, so what's the story here? Does that mean that a certain percentage of Sefer Torah for sure apostle? So there's a Minchas Chinuch on this topic. Minchas Chinuch is in Mitzvah Tov Reish Yud Gimel. It's the last mitzvah, At Kisvu. So the Minchas Chinuch says that you're not mekayim the mitzvah till it's kedin Sefer Torah. If you have a chaser, a yater, yeah. So it's a Gemara, it's a Rambam. According to this, mitzvah zu refefes biyadenu. Then the whole mitzvah is very shaky because the Gemara itself in Kedushin seems to say, it talks about the vav of gachain, and then it says, is vav of gachain in the middle of the Torah or not? And the Gemara says, inu bekim bechasedes v'yasedes, and unlike bekim, that once upon a time they knew all the chaser and the yater, the vavs, the yuds. Now we're not so bucky, so we don't know how many letters there really are in the Sefer Torah. By the Gemara's own admission, we're not bucky. Then could be we're writing Mali Chaser and Chaser Mali, and they're not being Mekayim the mitzvah. And he says, actually, the Shraga Zarya in Simon Vav says, maybe that's why we're potter from the mitzvah of Bizman Hazeh. You know why we're potter from the mitzvah of Bizman Hazeh? Because Eino Nubakim, Chaseres v'Yaseres. We're not even sure we're writing the Sefer Torah right. So what's the point of saying be Mekayim the mitzvah, where chances are you're probably not being Mekayim the mitzvah? He says, it comes to Tefillin, probably Bucky in the Arba Parshias. Otherwise, the mitzvah's film would also be shaky. It's mitzvah Tzmidus, Dalet Parshias. We have to say we didn't forget the Dalet Parshias. But the rest of the Torah, it's hard to say. We're on top of the whole Torah. On the other hand, how could it be? How did they allow this to happen? I mean, it's very important to have a Sefer Torah written correctly. It seems in time of Tanoim they weren't talking that way. It seems like they did have all the Chaseres v'Yaseres. Yeshem Lemikra, Yeshem Lemaseiris, you have all kinds of drashas and chazal that are based on whether there's a vav or not. Without the vav, you read the word a little differently. You can darshan from that. So the Amiram suddenly forgot. So he says, according, in my opinion, there's two kinds of chaseris v'yaseris. There's a chaser and yater that changes the meaning of the word. So, for example, the drashas, he says one of the examples is besukas teishvu. So we darshan that it says besukais, but it doesn't say with vavs. It says beis samach kaf saf. The sukkahs. So from there we darshan that the sukkah shetachas a bias pasul, how many drashas relating to sukkah. So if this type of word, if there was a vav in that, if you accidentally put a vav in that word, you would ruin the whole drasha. You're ruining a lot of that's a chasan yater that actually matters. Goes on, he describes different yishem likish. The Maseres comes up in different contexts. Then he says the chaseres v'yaseres where it doesn't change the pirush hateva at all. He says, for example, the word Aaron. In Parashas Tetzaveh, there's a place where there's the word Aaron, and there's a Maseres that say that it's with a vav, which is unusual, and some say no. I saw in some old Sefer Torah talk like that. So that's like a big machlekes that the Minchas Chinuch was attuned to. And then there's V'chein Petzuadako. You have a Maseres with an Aleph. He says, that's what I saw in the old Sefer Torah. Hilchos Chinuch says now everyone's writing with a hey. Minhag Ashkenaz became to write it with a hey. Also, it's not changing the Pirush HaTeva, even though now today the Maril the times that it is, because what's the word? What's the shirish? Two different words, B'chlal. But that's what the Hilchos Chinuch is saying. That doesn't change anything. So we can't say that we forgot the first type. So our halachas are based on that. Chas v'shalom, to say that our mitzvahs aseh, anything that affects our practice of the mitzvahs, certainly can't have been forgotten. But they forgot the other things, the things that, and that's what, and the Muslims are those things don't affect the mitzvah. So because it didn't affect the mitzvah, and it doesn't affect our understanding of Torah, so that's why they also tended to forget it. It wasn't, the taka wasn't so important. And even though Torah Kula Shmeizel Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu, but regarding the Kriya, if you read it out loud, no one will know. That's the problem with Vayihi and Vayiyu. That happens to be a bit of a change in Kriya, although it still doesn't really change anything in Havana, whether you say Vayihi or Vayiyu, so maybe Hilchos Chinuch would expand it just a bit more for that, but all the rest doesn't even affect the Kriya. Your mom is reading it the same way, with a Vav, without a Vav. So, otherwise, you can't say that he says in Svar Klal the mitzvah nahuga yishtaka chas v'shalom. The mitzvah that we're always practicing should be forgotten. The Yidden won't be mekayim mitzvah same in a Torah become a doiris chas v'shalom. So that's the Hilchos Chinuch's take on that whole subject, which is why I think if you ask, let's say you're in a show where the Sefer Torah has a daka with a hey, I think generally most Chabad Rabbanim will tell you that it's fine. You can make a bracha on it. It's not the end. Obviously, you don't want to, if you have the Sefer Torah yourself, you don't want to keep it that way. But anything where it doesn't change, where there's no mitzvah, there's no drasha that hinges on that chasav yatir and doesn't change the pronunciation, doesn't change the meaning, doesn't change anything. So clearly that must be the kind of thing that doesn't matter as much, and it's not ma'akev, and that's not the chasav yatir, that's ma'akev. Halacha Yud Beis, Sefer Torah she'ein muga, also the shahisa yasal shleishim yoyim. So if the Sefer Torah is not, it's not corrected, you can't keep it for more than 30 days. You taken or yignois. Either you fix it or you got to bury it. Gniza. Sefer Torah sheish b'shalosh toyas b'chol daf v'daf yitaken. If you have a Sefer Torah that every page has 3 mistakes, you can still fix it. Arba, if it has 4 in every page, yignois. That's only if it's the whole Sefer Torah that every page has mistakes. Sefer Muga, if already most of it was fine, or yesh be'arba toyas. Well, that one just a portion has even 4 mistakes in every page. V'nishar afilu daf echad ma'iseh ash'ar ha'meshubash. And if there's even one page that's not, how does he attack? And then you can still salvage Sefer Torah and fix it. And then clarifies. Remember this whole thing about 3 and 4. It's a situation where you left out, you skipped the letter, the word that should have been a male, you wrote it as a chaser. So now what are you going to do? Right? There's no room. Where are you going to put this? Not just there's no room now, but even if you tried erasing it, presumably there wouldn't be room because you already wrote other words on the line. Well, so what are you going to do? So you end up sticking the letters sort of between the lines. So that's why we're saying that if you have 4 of those on every page of the entire Sefer Torah, at that point, it's too many of these letters that are sticking out.
Why is the cutoff 4 versus 3?
Don't know exactly, but that's the Gemara. The Gemara, you use those numbers. But if it was the kind of mistake where it's all the way around, where it should have been minus a letter and you added a letter, so there can be many mistakes on every page. In this case, you're going to be correct. You're going to be erasing everything and rewriting it. So then there's no limit. We already mentioned this actually in Perek Aleph when the Rambam mentioned about the Kaitzi Shal Yud. So because the Mishnah said it, really the Gemara doesn't say it at all about Sefer Torah. The Gemara only says it about Tefillin and Mezuzah, and we're bringing different rayas. And one of them was from this. That is it suggesting that you can actually lane with it with those mistakes? And no, you're supposed to fix it before you use it. Not that you keep it. Okay, that was that whole discussion over there. Let's just finish off. Halacha Yudalid. Mutter lichtav Torah chumash chumash. Go chumash b'fnei atzmai. Ve'em ben kedusha Sefer Torah hatam. Now you can write the Sefer Torah just as individual chumashim, each chumash on its own, and then it's not doesn't have the kedusha of the complete Sefer Torah. But you can't just write individual parshas of the Torah like its own little Megillah. You can't turn the Torah into a Megillah. Even for a child, for his practice, for his study, you can't.
Is it the individual chumashim you can write for laning?
No.
Or this is talking about pre-printing press.
Yes.
Everything had to be handwritten.
Yes, as we discussed about the mitzvah for them versus now. So initially the Sefer Torah is for learning, but let's say you're only learning from a particular chumash, so you did have individual chumashim. That's where the term comes from already back then, and it meant it's very identical to Sefer Torah, just not a complete Sefer Torah. So that you could do, but not a Megillah. And if your intent is that it's going to ultimately be turned into a full chumash, mutter. However, if you write it completely differently, if you write just 3 words on a line, and then you only write a Megillah, then you only write one parsha of the Torah or a few parshas of the Torah, then it's okay because it's so different, so drastically different than what a normal Sefer Torah looks like. You can actually have one Tanakh in one volume. Just keep writing. You finish your Sefer Torah and just keep writing Nevi'im, and then it's not a Sefer Torah anymore. It's just Tanakh. Tanakh, as an acronym, I think is from the last few hundred years, but Torah Nevi'im Miksuvim. And between each chumash you have the 4 lines, as we said before. And between each navi 3 lines, empty lines. And that goes for the Treyasar themselves, the 12 miniature Nevi'im also. You have to have 3 lines between each one. The idea being that if you want to just cut, you'll be able to cut neatly, it wouldn't be a problem. And this is the official order, the sanctioned order according to Yiddish and Makairis. Yeshua, V'Shaiftim, Shmuel, and Malachim. And now here is where it changes from your set of Tanakh at home. Yirmi of Yecheskel, Yeshaya to the Aser, so Yeshaya is moved over there. They say the Aksuvim, very different than what we're familiar with. Ros, V'Tilim, V'Iev, U'Mishlei, V'Keheles, V'Shir Shirim, V'Kinnis, that's Echa, V'Daniel, U'Megillah, that's Esther, V'Ezra, Ezra and Nehemiah are one Sefer. The division of Ezra and Nehemiah came later. V'Divrei Hayamim, that's the official order if you're writing the Torah Nevi'im Ksuvim in one line. So back to the Sirtut idea that you have to have those lines. But now that I'm saying that even if you write it on paper, you also have to have Sirtut. And the Rambam here, elsewhere, I think the Rambam says even a few words not. Here the Rambam says 3 words without Sirtut is okay. Yasser also, but more than 3 is not okay. So if you continue writing Nevi'im Ksuvim, then it's not a Sefer Torah anymore. Like a chumash, even though you have the whole Torah in it, but since you continued writing, so it diminished, it took away. It's not a Sefer Torah anymore. Din hayaser, din hachaser. Just like if you would have skipped part of the Torah, that would be din hachaser. It wouldn't be a Hilchos Sefer Torah. So din hayaser, if you add, it's also back to the Sirtut. Just to conclude. Finish the Rambam, but what's the story with Sirtut nowadays? Clearly, we're not makbid on Sirtut. So you already have Yishayim talking about that. So Yisrael quotes Rashba. The Rashba says that now you got to shleimim when you write letters, we're writing without Sirtut. So Rabbi Tam said that it's only if you're writing the pasuk for a drasha, more formal writing that we're not familiar with now. Ramban said, I'm also relying on that. So the Gemara is only talking about something that's, relating to Kisvei HaKodesh, very special ritual writing, but not for ordinary writing. So that's why we're not familiar with that halacha ourselves with our own writing nowadays.
Yeah.